My name is Ian Jewett. I am a pastor in Liberty, Maine, of a little church called Liberty Baptist Church. And I've been there in one capacity or another for about almost 4 years now. I've been there as a pastor for about 2.5 years. And it's a small congregation in rural Maine, and it's a wonderful group of saints who have been very kind to bring me on in my first pastorate and to bear with me as I learn to pastor a church and learn to preach. From a very young age, have been exposed to teaching and preaching. I was brought up in the Christian home to Christian parents who taught me the gospel, and was brought up in the context of a local church where there was faithful expositional preaching. But I don't know that I actually thought much about preaching itself during those years. Certainly the Lord used the preaching and the teaching in the context of that church to disciple me and to bring me to Christ, but I don't know that I thought much about preaching itself until I left the home. I was off at university and went through a sort of a spiritual revival over the course of that year, and I think that was a work of God in my heart, and was just devouring the Word of God, but also devouring as much preaching as teaching as I could. So obviously in the context of the church where I was there, but I was listening to 1, 2, 3 sermon podcasts a day because I was hungry to grow and I was hungry to learn, and over the course of that time started to value expositional preaching, because I was beginning to notice differences between these faithful preachers that I was listening to, but noticing some of them seemed to be in their preaching more focused around the Word, that it was the Word itself that was the meat and the joy of their ministry, and it was that kind of preaching that was feeding me most deeply in that time. And so I think that may have been the first time consciously I was recognizing that I love preaching, like I love good preaching, that this is food for my soul. First sermon I preached was at the church I grew up attending. I was at Fayette Baptist Church, and I can't remember if it may have been the summer before I went to Bible college, or it may have been soon after I started my theological studies. I don't know exactly where that fell. It was right around there. So I didn't have much training, and I can remember a sense of weight. One of the pastors approached me about preaching, knowing that I was sort of going in the direction of ministry, and I can remember the sense of weight of, I'm going to preach for the first time in front of a church, and I'm going to preach in my church, and to preach in this context that I've been taught, for so many years, and the sense of the weight of that. And I spent weeks and months, I think, preparing for that and digging into the passage of Scripture. It was in 1 Samuel, teaching on the David's victory over Goliath, God's victory over Goliath through David, and I've looked back on the notes of that sermon, even in the last couple of years since I've been preaching more regularly, and I thought this is not a great sermon, but man, that was a sermon that was covered in prayer, because I had a sense of the weight of that calling, and thankful for that opportunity. There was a lot that happened the first year or two after I went off to school and left the house. And over the course of that year or so, I went through a sort of a personal spiritual revival. There's a lot of factors going into that, but it was a year that the Lord was growing me more rapidly than I ever had. And as a part of that was that I was digging into the Word more seriously than I ever had in my life. And the Word was coming alive to me, as I was reading it and studying it in a way that it never had before. And so I'd say one factor there was just a love for the Word, a deepening love for the Word, and a desire not only that I would be able to understand it and to know the God who's revealed himself in this book, but also that others would see what I was seeing. And that began to manifest itself somewhat in just in the campus ministry that I was involved with, leading some small group Bible studies and getting a taste for what it's like to be able to lead people to the Word and to see them find good food there. And then the other, there's a lot going on that year, but I'd say the other main thing that was happening is I was wrestling with a sense of vocation and praying over a career pathway that I'd laid for myself but had not given over to the Lord. And so over the course of that year, as I was getting a growing love for the Word, my university studies were sort of becoming dry in my mouth, and had a growing sense of God's calling to ministry and to teaching the Word, and through prayer and conversations with a number of mentors and pastors in my life, came to the conviction that I should enroll in Bible college and move in the direction of vocational ministry. Certainly a lot has developed since that first sermon I preached. And a lot of that was that sermon was before I had any sort of formal preparation in homiletics. I was very grateful for the training I got at the Bible college, and Dr. Johnson was my preaching professor there. Very grateful for him. That was very formative for me. And in terms of what's changed since I've started preaching weekly, the formal elements of my preaching, I haven't changed too much. My basic structure of a doctrine, a main idea, and then working that out through application and points and subpoints, it's remained roughly the same. I'd say two main things have changed since I've started preaching weekly. One is that I've become a pastor, and so I started preaching weekly. Really over the course of the first year that I was at Liberty. My predecessor, Steve, was quite sick and growing more sick, and so gradually he was phasing out of preaching, and I was phasing in. And so by the time he passed away, I was preaching weekly. As I continued preaching, I began preaching in the context of actually being a shepherd of the congregation. And I think that was significant. It's one thing to be able to go to a text and to apply the text to a generic audience. But through the context of individual discipleship and walking with families through the death of a family member, and doing funerals and doing small group Bible studies, actually walking with people through practical questions that they were asking, practical struggles that they were working through, I think has been a significant shaping factor for my preaching. I'm not preaching to everyone in the world. I'm preaching to 30 people in Liberty, Maine, on a Sunday morning who've gone through various things in the past week and have struggles and questions and doubts, and so I certainly pray that that's been a shaping factor on my preaching. One significant change in my preaching preparation and delivery over the last couple of years has been moving away from a manuscript, and that was nothing I would have predicted, given my disposition. When I first started preaching, actually I tried preaching just from an outline a couple of times, and I failed, absolutely bombed, and my recall was not good, and my nerves overcame me, and so I very much had a sense I'm a manuscript man, and it was actually through the Rephidim Project and through a preaching cohort that I'm a part of that we read a book, and so I was trying to think of the name of the book this morning, and I can't remember it. I don't remember the name of the book or the author, but it was one book that we were reading as a part of the Rephidim Project, and there's one chapter in one book where this guy just made an all-out case that he was convinced that sort of extemporaneous preaching, and he was advocating no notes in the pulpit other than the Bible in front of you. That in his experience, that was his most sort of freeing and lively way of preaching. And so one of the guys in the cohort had tried it after reading the book, and we had the cohort on a Saturday morning, and I had this author in my ear saying, you should try it, and then one guy in the cohort. And so I went home on a Saturday afternoon, I had a finished manuscript in front of me, and I went home and read through it, and thought, well, I'll give it a try, and did a run through without notes, and there I had it. The whole sermon was in my head, right? And so I was able to preach it that Sunday morning, and since then I haven't gone back to preaching with a manuscript. So that's been a significant change. I don't think it's I think a lot depends on personality and temperament, and I don't think we should make absolute rules in terms of manuscript or non-manuscript, but I've found it very freeing, and my most reliable critics, which would be my wife and our deacons, have said it's like you're a new man, and so I'm thankful for that change. Certainly my hope and my prayer is that everything I'm doing in ministry is shaped by my own living faith in Jesus and in the power of the Word. And it seems to me the most powerful ministry I've had has been the stuff that's come out of something that I've actually experienced in my walk with the Lord. And that my preaching and my teaching feels most alive when it's come out of walking with the living God in my study and in prayer and in the Word. In terms of how has faith shaped your ministry? It's a broad question. I'd say in terms of trusting God, if that's the kind of faith we're talking about shaping my ministry, I'd say that's the only way I'm able to walk out onto the limb, is to understand God accomplishes things in His Word, and that when I go into the pulpit, or when I'm walking into the counseling room, or going to the bedside of someone who's dying, I feel a real sense of inadequacy. I don't actually have anything to bring except for the Word, and that's actually enough. That God is faithful to work in the power of His Word and in the power of His Spirit through imperfect, broken vessels. And so that's, if I'm seeing things rightly, obviously there's days when I walk in self-sufficiency, but when I'm seeing things rightly, the only way I can get up and walk out the door or walk into the study is with a sense of trusting that God is at work. I'd say one thing which certainly shapes my preaching and my teaching is the teaching and preaching that I've sat under, and that would be sort of childhood through today, and both in terms of local church contexts, preaching I've sat under, teaching I've sat under, but also in the internet age, access to so much good, solid teaching, and so there's a number of preachers and teachers there who've just by sitting in that kind of teaching, I think inevitably have been shaped by that. I think one thing that's been very helpful in terms of shaping my preaching and my teaching has been the Rephidim preaching cohort. And we only meet quarterly. I see these men 4 times a year, but it's incredible the influence that's had on my preaching. And really, almost as soon as I was preaching weekly, I was plugged into a preaching cohort, and that's been incredibly helpful, because I'm getting consistent feedback from men who are in the trenches, and in that group there's beginning preachers, and then there's real experienced preachers, and that breadth of feedback is really helpful. And I mentioned earlier, my congregation is very kind to me, so I tend to get good feedback. The critical feedback tends only to come from my wife, and that's really helpful. Maybe she's the number two influence, but the preaching cohort has been really helpful in terms of shaping both exegesis and application, really the whole thing. And then maybe a third factor would be what I mentioned earlier in terms of the congregation. It's really easy to get caught up in everything going on in the broader evangelical world. And I've sort of go back and forth on how connected I want to be in terms of the controversies of the day. But I tend to find that after I disconnect from the controversies of the day, and I'm focused more on Liberty, Maine, and the people who are sitting in the pews on a Sunday morning, I don't feel like I'm missing much. And that the primary, I guess maybe this is more aspirational than anything, my goal in terms of how my preaching would be shaped is by the word and prayer, focused at the needs of the people who are sitting in the pews in front of me. And so I certainly hope that my preaching has been shaped primarily by them, and not preaching to Twitter or the Christianity Today editorial board. I'm married to my wife, Miranda. We have 2 kids, Nora, who's 1.5, and a baby boy who'll be born at the end of next month. And so we've got a growing little family, and that occupies a lot of my time between church and family. That's most of my time. And with a little spare time I can get here or there, I love to play music. I'm in a band with a handful of guys, 2 of which are also pastors, and the other of which also works for Christian ministry. So we have fun playing, and that's probably one of my main hobbies. I came into the pastorate in the middle of COVID, so that was a challenge to some degree. Really thankful for the unity of our church, and God's graciousness in keeping those bonds of unity together. There's obviously a lot of difficult decisions figuring out what to do with that, but I'd say the most significant challenge so far has just been the nature of my transition into the ministry, where I was able to work with my predecessor, Steve Daniels, at our church for about a year before he passed away. And then walking the church through a mourning process and a grieving process, not just for him, but over the course of that year, we had 4 or 5 folks involved in the church pass away. And so it's just a real season of grief, and so I'd say that's maybe been this most significant challenge of my ministry so far. Well, I try to be intentional about staying connected in a variety of ways, in part because we're a Baptist church and we're not affiliated with any kind of denomination or association, and so I don't have any formal ties with the larger Christian community through the church, but I'm really grateful for a lot of connections I have with the church at large. I have, the Rephidim Project, that preaching cohort's really helpful. I have a couple of pastors who I consider mentors, who I meet with on a regular basis, and that's been really helpful. We have a group of pastors in Waldo County that we've just started throwing together the last year or so, that we're trying to meet together regularly just for prayer and for fellowship, and that's been really, really sweet, really wonderful. And then I have a couple of, well, including the guys in the band, a couple of friends who are pastors, and so it's good to get together with them and chat and vent and whatever. So it's nice to have connections on those variety of levels where friends and mentors and sort of more formal training venues as well. And so in those between those various different contexts, I feel well connected with Jesus' church in Maine at large. I think when I came into the ministry, my first experience a call to the ministry, I knew I would love study because that's my disposition, and I do. I love that part. I love being able to dig into the Word. I love wrestling with a text. I love wrestling through how to structure a message. I love that part of it, and I love the delivery of preaching itself. Particularly when, on a week when I'm particularly personally affected by the sermon itself, that there's a real joy in that, and that's been sort of consistent since I've started preaching. It's just this is, I've heard other preachers reference Eric Liddell's words. When I run, I feel God's pleasure. It's like, and there's something in that. It's like when I preach, I feel God's pleasure. Like this is what the Lord would have me to be doing. But I think, and maybe this was not what I expected, but I think the greatest joy in preaching ministry is to have brothers and sisters in the church who are obviously affected and growing by it. And I think that's the most rewarding thing, is to see people growing in the Word and in their love of Jesus, and so I'd say that's the biggest joy. I grew up in a generation as a young person where we were already immersed in social media, and so I've wrestled with my own attention span and short attention span. I think one thing to consider is just sermon length. This is something I have to watch myself for. I can tell when people begin shifting in their seats and we've gone too long. There's a time where the Puritans were preaching 2-hour sermons. There's places in the world where that may be doable. I don't think that's possible in Liberty, Maine. And obviously there's so much that goes into determining what's the appropriate length for a sermon. I'm not an expert on contemporary culture or on the psychology of attention spans, but I know in my experience, good preaching grips me, and bad preaching, even if it's 20 minutes long, leaves me wanting to get out the door after 5 minutes. Just speaking from my own experience, when I'm sitting under preaching that makes Jesus glorious, that shows me the wonder of what's in the Word, right? that grips me. I don't care if it's 45 minutes or 25 minutes. I'm carried along by it. And so, again, I'm in no position to make sweeping judgments on this culture. But in terms of my own ministry, what I aim for is to give the congregation what I would want from a preacher, from a pastor, and that is a delicious meal from the Word. We're in a generation that's saturated by media inputs. You can plug into your screen, TikTok or whatever, and be entirely immersed by stimulation and entertainment with literally no end. Right? It's infinite. I don't. In my own ministry, I don't see it as my responsibility to compete with that level of stimulation. I don't think that's my job as a pastor. And in some ways, trying to do so, I don't think would do justice to the power of the Word. I see my responsibility I try not to preach too long, right? There's attention spans that shouldn't be pushed too far. But I find in my own experience that my sometimes too short attention span, conditioned by social media and media stimulation, is gripped by preaching that delivers the Word of God. It's something like going over to someone's house for a meal. If bad food is put in front of you, no matter how long the meal is, even if you're only there for 15 minutes, right, you want to get up from the table right from the get-go. But if you go over to someone's house and they put in front of you a delicious feast, right, a 5-course meal, and each course is better than the last, right, you never want to get up from the table. You want more. You're left saying, you leave saying, when can we come back, right? And that's my experience with good preaching, that when I'm sitting under the preaching of the Word of God, and the pastor has obviously taken care to dig rich treasures from the mine of the Word, right, and to lay them all out and to prepare this beautiful feast, that I'm left saying, I want more of this. And so that's my goal in preaching, is not to try and compete with what the world can serve up on TikTok or wherever else, but to give people the Word, to dig into the Word, and that's if anything's going to happen, that's where the power's going to come, right? Is from God at work through His Word and through His Spirit, and to spend the week getting potatoes and onions and whatever else, getting good food from the Word and preparing it in such a way that I can put it in front of my people on Sunday and say, eat, look and see that the Lord is good. So I'm no cultural expert, and I'm no expert on the psychology of attention spans. But that's my approach: is give them the Word, right? Give them Jesus, give them good food, and they'll be left asking for dessert.